When I woke up here in Miami yesterday, first thing I did was call my wife, Ernestine, in Los Angeles. First thing she said to me, man, it's so foggy, I can't see across the street. I didn't think anything about it. I later read that the LA Police Department grounded all of its helicopters all morning yesterday in the Los Angeles area because it was just too foggy to fly. So a couple hours passed here yesterday, and I posted a picture on social media of a car that my friend Lil Wayne is going to let me use this week. And I was proud of that picture, and about 1 minute passed, and my phone rang as I walked back through the lobby of our hotel, and it was Ernestine. And I thought, oh, she saw the picture. Maybe she liked it. She usually doesn't like any of my pictures. And she was crying like I'd never heard her cry in the 15 years we've been together. She couldn't even spit out what she was crying about, and I was horrified because I thought something had happened to her or somebody at home.
Sure.
And she finally managed to get out, Kobe died. I said, no, that's not possible. And the details, as you said, were sketchy. And I spent the next 10 minutes trying to talk her off the ledge because I said, they got this wrong.
Right.
It just can't be. No, Kobe did not die. And then once the gravity of it struck me, I spent the next half hour in denial, to your point, because there's no way Kobe could die.
Right.
He was too big to die. He was too great to die.
Right.
If you had given me a list of 10,000 people yesterday morning and said one of these people is going to die today, I might have put Kobe Bean Bryant at the bottom of my list. He was just too big. And yet, I spent the rest of the day, as maybe a lot of us did, having to come to grips with my own mortality. Because if he can go, any of us can go.
Yes.
It hit me right between the eyes once again to your point, how fragile life is, how fleeting it can be. It is here today and gone tomorrow. And the ultimate cliche is we're not promised tomorrow.
Right.
And the other ultimate cliche is you've got to live and love every single moment. That's the ultimate truth of life. And if there's any silver lining to this, it made us all stop and say,
Super Bowl Sunday. Any 49er fans? All two of you. Good. Any Chief fans? One of you. Does anybody care? No, I didn't think so. Okay. All right. Well, I'm a big fan of the Super Bowl. I love NFL football, but as many of you know, I'm an even bigger basketball fan. And in 1996, I was a freshman in college playing basketball, and in that same year, a young man named Kobe Bryant was drafted by the Charlotte Hornets and then traded to the Los Angeles Lakers. And as I pursued, the number of years that followed, as I pursued my calling, I admired Kobe Bryant as he pursued his. And it wasn't necessarily who he was off the court, and you can get into that, and it wasn't even what he did on the basketball court so much. I mean, that was amazing, but what really made me fall in love with Kobe Bryant, really, and become a fan of his was his drive and determination. He was a guy who just had it in him and believed and had this confidence that he wanted to be the best of the best. They say that there are 400 players in the NBA and that the 400 best basketball players in the world make it to the NBA because there's not another comparable league in the world. And so the best basketball players in the world, for the most part, are in the NBA. And for me as a basketball player growing up, I would gladly be number 400 of 400. Like, I would ride the pine on any team in the NBA. I would do anything just to be one of those 400 players in the NBA. But that wasn't enough for Kobe Bryant. No, for him, he had to be the best of those 400 people. And he had this drive, this will, this determination. He had this dog. He had what is called the Mamba mentality, this mentality that just pushed him to strive to be the best. And as I was pursuing my calling, as I was pursuing my calling of God to be a pastor and to serve in ministry, I wanted to try to adapt that mentality, that philosophy, that drive to excel, that drive to put in the work, to put in the time, and to do everything I could do with excellence. He pushed me to want to be better at what God called me to do. And last Sunday after church, we had an amazing service last week, amazing couple of services, amazing morning. I was so encouraged and so pumped up and just went home just like, wow, what a great, great morning, and just have sensed God's presence with us as we gathered in the midst of a gong show snowstorm, and we've got a little one today. But I went home and I was looking forward to my nap, which is my Sunday afternoon routine. I kind of lay it out on the line on Sunday morning, and then I go home and sleep it off in the afternoon. And I was looking forward to that nap, and instead I was blitzed on my phone. And like Skip Bayless in that quote, I didn't think it was Lisa, my wife, texting me. I thought it was a bunch of people like you texting me going, great message, great sermon today, blah, 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 all this other stuff. No, it wasn't that. It was all the people who know me and know how much I loved Kobe Bryant telling me the news. And that afternoon, and in fact, if I'm honest, all week, I've been in shock. And I've got to be honest with you and say that I've never had, and this is, take it for what it's worth, I've never had a celebrity death impact me the way that this one has. And it's not, again, just because he's a basketball player, and it's not because when we were picking names for our son a year ago that I had Kobe at the top of my list. It's not for any of those reasons. It's not just because he was a basketball player and, ooh, you like, It's because, as Skip said in that quote, it hit really close to home for me. I look at it and I say, I'm the same age as Kobe Bryant. Like Kobe, I have a 13-year-old daughter. I have a young child. I have an incredible wife I don't deserve. And like Kobe Bryant, my whole life is ahead of me. So much to do, so much I want to do. And then in an instant, it's gone. In an instant, in a tragic instant, doing something he'd done 1,000 times before. And last Sunday, I'm sure he didn't think that the day would be his last. And all week, I've just had this, I can't escape this sobering reality that it could just as easily have been me. Now, for those of you that are visiting this morning, for those of you that are watching or listening online for the first time, we've been in this series for the last couple weeks called What If? And the whole idea behind this series is that I think one of the reasons many of us don't experience the change that we want to experience in our lives is because we don't allow that question, what if, to sober us long enough to really evaluate some things that are going on in our lives. And the minute that it gets too close, the minute that we start to feel it in our chest, the minute that question, what if, starts to reveal some things in us or about us, we switch gears as fast as humanly possible. And we start instantly trying to think of something else, or we run to something else. In many cases, we run to someone else. But the question I want to continually ask myself and encourage you to ask yourself is simply this: what if? What if? What if the car hadn't swerved? What if you'd gotten caught? What if that prognosis had been different? What if you'd started? What if you'd stopped? What if you'd asked? What if you'd said yes? What if you'd said no? And so for the last couple weeks, we've been asking this question, what if, and we've been looking at a famous moment in history that's found in the scripture, specifically the book of 1 Samuel chapter 17. And the story that we've been talking about ends like this. It says, so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and he killed him. Now, many of you, if not all of you, to varying degrees, have heard the story of David and Goliath. Many of you are probably like, oh man, we're going to hear this one again, right? Because you know how the story ends, right? We know what's going to happen. We know that Goliath goes down. But what we've been looking at, we've been asking this question, what if, because every single one of us, even though we know how this story ends, every single one of us with every day of our life is living another page in the story of our life. And even though we know that Goliath goes down in David's story, David still has to live out this story in the face of uncertainty. As we said, David never had the luxury of reading 1 Samuel 17:50. He doesn't know how it's going to end in the midst of that moment. And even though you've heard 100 sermons about how David defeats Goliath, as we've been saying, there are 3 things that David faces before he ever stands in front of Goliath. And for the last couple weeks, we've looked at 2 of those 3 things and asked the question simply, what if? What if it had ended differently? What if David had made some different decisions along the way? If he had, it wouldn't have ended the way that we all know that it ended, and it wouldn't be the story that you know. And so we've been kind of following along David's journey, asking the question, what if? 2 weeks ago, we looked at the beginning of the story, and we saw how David's father, Jesse, gave him a simple task of taking some food down to his brothers on the battle lines, and we just simply asked the question, What if? What if David had been typical? What if David had tripped over the ordinary? What if David had felt slighted because he felt he was asked to do something that he deemed insignificant? And the big takeaway from week 1, if you missed it, was opportunity presents itself as ordinary. Opportunity presents itself as ordinary. And because David embraced the ordinary, it moved him one step closer to something that would define him as extraordinary. And last week, I know, again, we were in the midst of a snowstorm. Many of you might have missed last week, but for those of you that did, last week we looked at this amazing moment in David's story where he has to face, get this, an offense before he ever stands and faces Goliath. That David's oldest brother, Eliab, was jealous of him, and when David got down to the battle lines, Eliab questions his heart, questions his character, and we simply ask the question, what if? What if David in that moment when his heart is being called into question, what if David stands there and argues with his brother? What if for the next 2 hours he defends himself to his oldest brother, Eliab? Now, Eliab wasn't his enemy. Eliab wasn't the giant. Eliab was the brother that he was supposed to be there fighting for. And so the big takeaway last week was sometimes you're fighting against what you're supposed to be fighting for. And many of us find ourselves, whether it's in our marriages or in our jobs or in our certain relationships, we fight against the very things, fight oftentimes against the very people we're supposed to be fighting for. And so if you missed either one of those messages, I would encourage you maybe to go onto our webpage, bridgechurches.ca. You can catch up there, or you can download our podcast, because I really believe that what we're seeing in the midst of David's story can really help you as you live out yours. Now today, we're going to pick up really quickly and get you out of here in time to get your wings in the oven. But we're going to look at this, and we're going to continue on, and we're going to look at the third thing that David faces before he ever stands and faces Goliath. And so we remember we get down there. They've been there. The Israelites have been on the one side of the battlefield for 40 days. Goliath represents the Philistine army, and he's coming out and defying the Israelites, and he's defying their God, and he's saying, he's calling them out and saying, bring out a champion on your behalf to fight me on the battlefield. Winner takes all, right? And so David gets down there. They've been there for 40 days. David shows up late to the party, and he gets down there, and he starts talking to some men. And these men are telling him about Goliath, tell him about what's been happening. And David begins to speak out. He begins speaking out, and we don't know exactly what he said, but we know it was enough that it started kind of circulating through the people, and eventually it makes its way back to King Saul himself. And that's where we're going to pick it up in verse 31. It says this. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and so Saul sent for him. So Saul gets wind that finally there's someone who's willing to step up and step out onto the battlefield and fight. And so Saul calls for David to be brought before him. And so David says to Saul, and this is really interesting, David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Now, when someone... And you know this, when someone comes against you, or when someone defies what you believe in, or when someone defies what you believe in, especially when they come from what you perceive to be a position of strength, it's debilitating. I mean, you can lose heart quickly and easily when those people speak up against you, when a financial expert crushes your dreams, or when a doctor tells you there's no hope, or when a professor or a teacher tells you there's no God. And you can lose heart in those moments because they're stronger than you. They're smarter than you. They have more experience than you. They're more educated than you. They're more resourced than you. And you can lose heart because of what they say or what they do in those moments. And David recognizes in this moment, because of the size of Goliath and how intimidating he is, that the potential is there for the people to lose heart. And he says, don't let anyone lose heart because of that guy. I'm willing to go out and fight him. And you'd think after 40 days of hearing this same song and dance from Goliath, you'd think that in this moment, Saul, King Saul, would be ecstatic, right? I mean, finally, after all this time, someone is willing to go out there and fight. But instead of celebrating David, Saul actually gives David another battle that he has to fight. Here's what happens. It says, Saul replied, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man. And he's been a warrior from his youth. He's like, you're not able to go out and do that. You're not able to go out and fight him. David wants to. David wants to head to the battlefield and fight Goliath. But he has to go through Saul first. Saul, who should have been celebrating him. Saul, who should have been encouraging him and supporting him. And even though we know how this story ends, it could have ended. It could have ended in a different way. It could have ended with David, having a bad attitude towards the ordinary. It could have ended with David tripping over an offense and fighting with his brother that he should have been fighting for. It could have ended with ordinary. It could have ended with offense. And it could have ended with this one word, only. Only. Do you know only? Do you know only? That spirit, that attitude, that reality of only in your life, that reality of limitation in your life, do you know only? What Saul pointed out in David and about David, you're only. What's your only? What's the only that other people point out in your life? And remember, Saul wasn't his enemy. Saul was his king. Saul was supposed to be his ally. Have you ever had somebody that's on the inside turn against you? Have you ever had somebody on the inside of your life point out what you're only? What's your only? I wonder, what would have happened? What if, just humor me, what if David had listened to Saul? What if he had got down to the battlefield and said, look, I'm ready to go out and fight this guy. I'm going to take him down. I'm going to fight him. I'm going to beat him down. I'm going to win. I'm going to be victorious. And what if Saul said, but you're only a boy? And what if David had said, you know what? You're right. What was I thinking? I'm so fool. I can't even, there you go. I'm just a kid. I don't know what I'm talking about. You're right. I'm out of here. And he goes home. What if? Well, if that had happened, it wouldn't have ended the way we know it ended, and the story wouldn't be the story that you know. What if David had listened to Saul? What if David had been sobered by what he's only? I wonder what's your only in your own mind? I had mine this week. As I mentioned, I kind of had a weird week of introspection, and this week I thought, you know what, Scott, I'm only a preacher. And as I look out and as I see culture and who's impacting and changing culture, it's the celebrities, it's the musicians, it's the movie stars, it's the athletes, and I'm thinking, what am I? I'm only a preacher. And yet I have this dream, I have this passion, I have this burden to see this church make more churches and create churches all across this city. That people who are unchurched will find a home and find a relationship with Jesus Christ. That people who used to go to church or used to have faith that were for one reason or another walked away. I have this dream of seeing those people return and find and renew their faith and renew their trust and renew their relationship with Jesus Christ. And then I think, I'm only a preacher. Well, nobody's going to listen to me. What good can I do? And thankfully this week through another preacher, I was reminded of a passage of Scripture where God spoke to a prophet named Jeremiah. It's found in the book of Jeremiah, amazingly. But in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 7, God speaks to Jeremiah and he says, do not say, I am only. And I've been reflecting on that verse and reflecting on what I had heard about that verse this week, and I've just been thinking, you know what? The more I focus on I am only, the less I'm focusing on a God who said, I am. That as you look back in the Scriptures in the second book of the Bible, when you look in the book of Exodus, you find a man named Moses, a man who many of you, if not all of you, have heard of. Moses in the Scriptures in the book of Exodus finds himself on the side of a mountain, and he has an encounter with God. God reveals himself to Moses through a burning bush, and he speaks to him, and he reveals his plan and his purpose for Moses' life. And he says, Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt where you were raised. I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to lead my people, the Israelites. I want you to lead them out of captivity, out of slavery, out of Egyptian bondage, and I want you to lead them to the promised land. I want you to stand in front of Pharaoh, and I want you to say, let my people go. And Moses is like, what? And he's like, well, when I stand in front of Pharaoh, who do I say sent me? And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, God said, tell him, I am sent you. I am. See, when I focus on what I am only, I cease to focus on a God who said, I am. In other words, I am only diminishes God's presence and purpose in your life. I am only diminishes God's presence and his purpose in your life. And in this moment, Saul is quick to point out what David is only, and I'm sure even for maybe a second, David was tempted to listen and hear that, like many of us are tempted to hear that when people point out what we are only, or when we look in the mirror and see what we are only. But thankfully, that didn't happen. David said to Saul this is really great. David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. So David has heard what he's only, but he's about to go off on this monologue for a couple of verses and rebuke everything that Saul has pointed out that he's only. So he says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and he goes on. He says, when a lion and a bear carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And he says, when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. This guy's a bad man. He says, your servant, he goes on this monologue, your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because why? He has defied the armies of the living God. And then get this, he goes on, he says, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul sighs and shrugs his shoulders, and he says, you're only a boy. And David has a completely different body language, a completely different response. I mean, do you see it? Do you sense it? I mean, as you read between the lines of that, the conviction and the confidence as he pulls back his shoulders and says, no, you don't understand. I've brought the same God to this valley that has been with me in all of the other valleys I've faced. And the reason this message is so important, the reason I'm so glad you're here, and the reason why this series is so important is because I know that there are those of you right now that are facing something. You're facing a situation, you're facing a circumstance, you're facing a season of your life that you've never been in front of before, and it's bigger than you. And in this moment, it's easy, you're tempted, you're focusing on what you're only and what you only have or what you only don't have. And David in this moment is so confident. And he stands up and he steps out and he pulls back his shoulders and he says, you don't understand. The God that I have with me in this valley is the same God that I brought with me into all the other valleys of my life. And I'm seeing this pattern emerge in my life. There was a lion in my life that went down. There was a bear in my life that went down. And if that lion didn't stand a chance, and if that bear doesn't stand a chance, this giant who opposes God's purpose and plan in my life, this giant who comes against my Father's business, he's going down. And I can't predict what's going to happen in the Super Bowl today, but I can predict an upset victory in your life over those areas or those things in your life that are bigger than you, that oppose God's plan and God's purpose in your life. I declare an upset victory in your life. And so here's this moment, and this could be the turning point of the whole story if it goes, and if David does and responds in a different way. Saul has said, you're just a boy, you're simply a boy, you're only a boy. But David has stood in confidence, not focusing on what he's only, he focuses on a God who says, I am. And so after this dialogue between a king and a kid, Saul said to David this, go, and the Lord be with you. Go, and the Lord be with you. Have you ever had someone else's faith stir up your own? Have you ever had someone else's confidence in God stir up your own confidence? That's what happens here. And so Saul sends him and says, go, the Lord be with you. And not only does he send him off, but he tries to equip him as he goes. It says this, Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. And it says, David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. He'd never worn these things. He'd never fought in this way. And if I could get personal for just a minute, it's been a humbling honor to serve you as lead pastor of this church for the last 7 months. It's been an unbelievable ride. And again, many of you have been so supportive. It's so encouraging. You've reminded me that you're praying for me and that you believe in what God is wanting to do and wanting us to be as a church. And one of the things that's been amazing and yet new for me in this role is having someone in my corner like Alan Summers. Most of you, if not all of you, know that Alan served as the lead pastor of this church for 15 years. He has over 40 years of pastoral ministry experience. And not only that, he's my father-in-law. So he wears a number of different hats in my life, and through these last 7 months, it's been unbelievably encouraging and humbling to have someone like him in my corner, someone who I can just sit down with and say, have you ever felt this way? Have you ever wondered about this? Have you ever struggled with that? Have you ever had to make this type of decision? And to just sit and listen to this person who has so much experience and so much wisdom. And it's sometimes as I'm talking to him, I feel like I'm drinking from a hose. It's just like there's just so much coming back at me. And in all those moments, and as we've gone through this transition, and as Alan has been there to listen and to encourage and to guide, one of the things I'm reminded of, in different times of your life, you will have people who will put their perspective on how you should go about fighting certain battles in your life. They'll try to put their perspective on you in the same way that Saul is trying to put his armor on David. And as I've gone over these last 7 months, and as I've struggled and questioned and prayed and wondered and dreamed and hoped and everything in between, and as I've been reminded of how much history and heritage and legacy I'm following in terms of Alan as a leader, Alan has never once made me feel like I need to do things the way he would do them. In fact, I know that there are big shoes to fill, but Alan has never once suggested that I wear his. And here's David in this moment, and Saul is trying to put on his perspective, put on his armor onto David, and David just doesn't feel right. And he says this, he says, I can't go in these. I can't go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. And so he took them off. And this is the test. This is the test that you face. It's the test that I face. It's believing and trusting in God, knowing how we believe the story ends, but having no idea how it's actually going to get there. Right? It's like I can have a confidence that God is going to do this, but I have no idea how it's going to happen. And for you, it might not be simple. For you, it might not be pretty. It might not be easy. It might not be the way it plays out for other people. And you'll look at it and go, why is it so easy for them? Why does it always work out for them? And for me, it's always so difficult and rocky roads, and it never just seems to be this straight line or this simple or this pretty for me. Why? And sometimes you can get into the worst trouble of your life trying to wear Saul's armor, trying to fight like everybody else fights. And for you, it might play out, it actually might be downright laughable. But here's what I want to encourage you with today, and here's what I'm learning in my life. It's just simply this: embrace. Embrace your only, because God is going to get that much more glory because of what you don't have. Embrace your only. And here's David in this moment. You just have to embrace it. It's not knowing how things are going to work out in the end. It's knowing that, yes, I believe that God has a plan, and I believe that God wants to do this in my life, and I believe in this, and I believe that in what I'm going after, and believing in this dream, but I have no idea, but I'm going to embrace what I'm only. And so David sheds what he's not, and he embraces what he's only, and then it says this in verse 40. It says, then he took his staff in his hand, he chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch on his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. And spoiler alert, Goliath goes down. But it's so much more than that. In fact, this story doesn't even end the way that we think that it ends, and we'll talk about that next week. But until then, I want to encourage you. I want to challenge you to stop looking in the mirror and feeling deflated and defeated because of what you are only. I want to encourage you to embrace it. Embrace it. Stop saying, I'm only, and start remembering that you have a God who says, I am. And for Jeremiah and for David, their only was their youth. And for some of you, it might be your youth. For others of you, it might be your lack of youth. For some of you, your only might be your lack of experience or your lack of understanding, your lack of education, your lack of resources, your lack of funds, your lack of support. I don't know what your only is, but you do. And if you don't, my guess is other people will be quick to point it out in you. Isn't it nice to have friends? Those people in your life who should be on your side but quickly point out what you're only. And the temptation will be for you what it is always for me. And it will be to focus on what you are only and stop focusing on the God who is in your corner who says, I am. And my challenge, if you remember nothing else from today, what I hope you will download into your heart and carry with you not only today, but for the rest of your days. As you move forward and as you fight and battle that giant in your life, whatever or whoever it is, what I want you to hold in your heart and never let go of is simply this. Your only is a platform for God's presence and purpose to be put on display in your life. Your only is a platform for God's presence and purpose to be put on display in your life. So embrace what you're only, because it's through that God is going to get the glory for what he has and what he will do in your life. So we have ordinary, we have offense, and we have only. And if David trips over any one of these three things, this isn't the story that we know. And if you or if I trip over any one of these three things, your story isn't the story that you want to tell one day, no matter what it is you're going through. So we're going to conclude in David's story next week, but before and until then, I want to pray with you that you will hold on and embrace what you're only, because it's through that, it's through your only that God will get the glory for what he does in your life.